Connie Manes. I do serve on the advisory board for the CLCC, usually in a function that is about training and conference planning. Worked with Amy and Christina at CLCC for, I don't know, well over a decade, I think, at this point. Is that about right? Yeah. And I live in Kent. I do work for a Connecticut land trust. I work for the Kent Land Trust. I work also for the Litchfield Hills Greenprint Collaborative, which is a partnership of land trusts. More about that in a little bit. And I serve as a consultant, really all over the nation for the Land Trust Alliance, largely focused on board development, accreditation, standards and practices, organizational capacity. Okay, and we're just going to launch right in. So I have to tell you, when I first got into this work in 2008, I had no idea what a land trust did. I knew it was good, vaguely associated with the environment and the land and nature, which I supported, but I really did not know what land trusts did. And, I think it's a pretty good place to start just by letting you know that there's a new publication out through CLCC, which is What is a Land Trust? Very good, a good piece for outreach and for, working with your constituencies, but also, bringing us back to the basics of, what land trusts do, because they do a lot of things. But what are kind of the base commonalities between us all? Land trusts, they protect land. So, and the two primary ways that they do this is they own land, and that is called ownership and fee. So when you hear people talk about fee properties, it has nothing to do with cash. It has to do with owning the land. And then conservation easements are the second primary way that land trusts protect land. And that is when private property is encumbered by a restriction on development of the property in order to protect its conservation values. So either land ownership or conservation easements. Many land trusts use a mix of both of those. Some only use one or the other. Land trusts protect certain kinds of land. Most of the land trusts in Connecticut, I would say, protect like a mix of the land that is valuable for conservation purposes in their own communities, but some land trusts are really focused on working farms, on providing recreational opportunities, or you could also pick a specific resource like watershed protection. Once they own or protect land, land trusts take care of that land, or they oversee it and make sure that private property owners who have placed a conservation easement on their land are complying with the restrictions that they've put there. And so that is called stewardship, kind of what we refer to in the land trust world as stewardship. And it might include monitoring, and it might include land management. But land trusts do so many other things. And I have a couple of slides about that. There are almost 1,400 land trusts across the country. And somewhere upwards, I think, of 130 in Connecticut alone. So what else might land trusts do? Most land trusts offer recreational opportunities, public access to the lands that they own. Here you can see on the far left, you might know the Connecticut Forests and Parks Association manages the Blue Blaze Trails. They host Connecticut Trails Days in early June. The one in the middle on the left is the Simsbury Land Trust. I think I have people from Simsbury here tonight. They published the Walk Book in their town, and a cute little icon for their 12 Hike Challenge off of their website. I'm sorry if I've stolen any of your pictures, but I really just wanted to give you all a shout out. I think that the woman riding a mountain bike is in the Steep Rock Association trails. So, some land trusts have all access trails, or trails that are designed, for uses other than strictly walking and hiking. And then over on the far right, this little guy is fishing in a pond, a fish pond managed by the Middlebury Land Trust. So different ways that land trusts provide recreational access. Typically, land trusts are also providing education, all kinds of education for children and adults. Now there's a lot of virtual programming going on, certainly through e-newses and print newsletters, many in-person educational programs and camps. So up here on the top, you have New Canaan Land Trust's popular summer program. They have high school summer interns who do stewardship activities. You can see the e-news that the Wilton Land Trust sent out in February with, cute birds that are mating during February. I pulled the East Granby Land Trust program on birdscaping off of their website today. And then here on the far right is the popular summer camp program that Gather New Haven runs, which is a sailing school. Next, land trusts also are, typically will have community gardens, or I don't know typically, but many of our land trusts support sustainable agriculture and farming in their communities. And so up at the top, two different ways that the Winterbury Land Trusts are doing that are by leasing a farm that they've protected, and also on the right, sorry, it's not the clearest picture, but making public land available for community gardening. And then down on the bottom is Gather New Haven's, one of Gather New Haven's urban gardens. And habitat restoration, another thing that many land trusts are involved in. Some of you are going to be familiar with the Pollinator Pathway logo. And on the right is the Farmington River Watershed Association. It's an image showing restoration of a stream bank and creation of a buffer area next to a waterway. Finally, social opportunities and ways to connect people. And so here on the left is the Essex Land Trust, a kayaking event. That looks like so much fun. I have in the middle the Branford Land Trust photo contest, and then over on the right-hand side, I believe that is in Canton, where they say that stewardship workdays are a party. And they are. They really are. Okay, couple of thoughts about land trusts in Connecticut, especially for those of you who are brand new. It can be really hard to navigate the plethora of conservation organizations that exist in Connecticut. But I think that largely due to CLCC, we are closer knit and we work very well together, more so than ever before. And so, here with these gears, you see that in Connecticut, this is not true really for the rest of the United States, but certainly here in Connecticut, we have a model where many of our land trusts are community-based and arose out of, a few concerned citizens in each town kind of saying, watching some of their most important lands get developed and saying, what can we do to prevent this? And really looking to their neighboring towns to say, oh, they have a land trust over there. Maybe we should make one too. So the way that the movement kind of arose in New England, in Connecticut, also in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, is that each and every town kind of got together a group of citizens to make a land trust. And then we have a couple of regional land trusts, or, we have places where land trusts have found synergies and economies of scale by forming regional trusts that take care of a number of different towns. Example of those might be Northwest Connecticut Land Conservancy here over in my neck of the woods, Avalonia Land Conservancy, Northern Connecticut Land Trust is another one, Wyndham, Aspetuck Land Trust. So those are kind of multi-town land trusts that serve a more regional function. A few land trusts operate on a statewide level. The Connecticut Farmland Trust, the Connecticut Forest and Parks Association are two of those, really focusing on farms and on trails respectively. The Trust for Public Land, the Nature Conservancy are two big guns that operate on a statewide level, and often these larger organizations try to partner with the local community organization to bring some resources to them, but also because the local and community-based organizations know their towns the best. And so those kinds of collaboration seem to work really well. We found in Connecticut over time that the many different local land trusts as they started to get to know each other, realized that they were all kind of facing the same challenges, going through some of the same things. They began to align. And so in many cases now and this is why I put that picture of a network, there's kind of been an emerging model for regional conservation partnerships, or RCPs, or even much looser kind of alignments or, ways that land trusts are cooperating, maybe sharing some staff, getting together and meeting on kind of a more regional basis. So some of the RCPs that you might have heard of include the Litchfield Hills Greenprint Collaborative, Hudson to Housatonic, H2H, operating kind of in the southern part of the state, the Lower Connecticut River and Coastal Regional Land Trust Exchange. I think I got it right. It's a long name, and the Quiet Corner Initiative, or I think it's a Quiet Corner Initiative. I'm sorry for I wrote abbreviations, so now I can't read my writing. Anyway, all different ways that many of us have been able to come together, communicate, get our work done more efficiently, share strengths and lessons learned, and still, maintain the community focus that we have in local and community-based organizations. So that's kind of the matrix of how things are going on in Connecticut, in the state, when you hear about these different organizations and how they operate together. But of course, this is really the lead up to one of the most important ways that land trusts convene in our state, and that is, under the umbrella of CLCC, which is always standing ready to help and support us. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment, turn this over to Amy Patterson, and she will talk a little bit about CLCC.
Okay, great. So for those of you that don't know me, so I'm going to try and walk and chew gum at the same time, which I tend to do. Okay, I did it. So my name is Amy Patterson, and I am the Executive Director of the Connecticut Land Conservation Council. And just seeing so many of you trickle in tonight, as well as perusing the registration list, I was very pleased to see how many names I recognized, and certainly every organization I know. And CLCC, as Connie had alluded to, is really the umbrella organization for the land conservation community in the state. We work most predominantly with the state's 130 plus or minus land trusts, but we also work with your communities. We work with COGS. We work with really all entities from the most municipal level right up to the state of Connecticut. We provide many services. We wear many hats. We provide training and education. We do workshops like this. We provide direct technical assistance or referrals to consultants like Connie. We have a number of programs that I'm going to outline just by going through our website. And we also advocate on behalf of the community at the Capitol. Right now, we are immersed in the legislative session. It's been an interesting one, to say the least, being that it's all virtual. But we are right there doing whatever we can to make sure that land conservation funding and climate change and other policies that impact our work are given highest priority. So with that, I'm going to talk about our programs and give you a quick tour of our brand new website. For those of you that know our old website, you're going to say, well, why didn't you tell us that you have a new website? And it's because we're just waiting to get some of the kinks out. We just went live last week. And so we thought, well, what better way to test it is than to start to show it to folks and let you start to explore it And please provide us with feedback on any kinks that you find or anything that you want to comment on. But we have a Find a Land Trust feature that will feature all of your land trusts. It's very easily searchable now. It will, let's do Aspetuck right on top here. And it will take folks to more information, but it will also take them to your website. We will have an interactive map, which is just about done, and that will be readily available as well. Connie had alluded to our conference. Up until this past year of 2020, it was the largest statewide gathering, as well as the largest state association gathering, according to the Land Trust Alliance, in the country. We were attracting between 500 and 550 people over the last few years, held annually at Wesleyan University. And it's just such a fun day, filled with workshops, great speakers, and most importantly, that sense of camaraderie and energy that you get when you're in the same room with lots of people that share your same passion. And it's just a great day, and we can't wait for 2022, which is when we will hopefully be able to have our regular conference again at Wesleyan in March. Meanwhile, having just canceled the March 2020 conference, we pivoted quickly with all of our programming, including the conference, and offered it virtually in October. And this year we're going to lighten it up a little bit, and we are going to offer it over the course of 4 days in June. And it'll be workshops and hopefully a little bit more interactive, and give you all a chance to talk to each other a bit more. We have here a feature that is really for conservation options for land trusts, but also for the landowners with whom you work. And so, like most of you, we have this on our website as well. Conservation programs are obviously very important, or conservation options are obviously very important for us to understand and to be able to share clearly with the landowners that you work with. Resources is a little easier to find now. We have a nice drop-down menu, and it'll lead you to a resource library. We have created some model documents, including model conservation easements that you can access. It will give you links to all of our publications, etc. Connie, you need to give me the sign when I'm going on too long. Quickly, programming. I started to rattle off some of it in my introduction, but as Connie had talked about, working on regional collaboration is something that we recognize is super important for land trusts. As she had shown in her visual, we really have a nice network of land trusts now in Connecticut. We offer a spectrum of opportunities for land trusts to get to know each other, from one-off regional summits right to some very intensive work through our Advanced Collaboration and Merger Assistance Program. So when you have a chance to play around with the website, you can click on some of these and see some of our deeper dive programs, including the conference and some of these other things. And then finally, advocacy. These are over here on the left are our areas of focus. If you've been, and I hope that you are getting our action alerts. If you're not, I'm going to show you how to sign up to get all of our e-news letters, which I'll talk about right at the end here. But we are really focusing right now on this municipal funding option, which is part of a larger bill called the Act Concerning Climate Adaptation. And we've been doing a lot of lobbying around that, meeting with legislators, had a public hearing last week that went quite well, but we'll see how it goes. These are all focus areas of our policy priorities. And then again, we have our other tools for you to learn. I have to just move myself away. And that really, I think, it's so nice to have this website, because I think it gives me an opportunity to talk and just give you a little taste about all the things that CLCC does for the land conservation community, with some nice added visuals to go along with it. So the last thing I will say is, if you scroll down, let's go back to the home page here. And if you scroll down to the very bottom, you'll see that there are some quick links here. Connie had said, what is a land trust? That will take you to the page that has the new booklet that we're offering. I hope it'll take you there. Maybe that's one of the kinks. But meanwhile, while this is spinning, you can go down here and make sure that you have signed up for our e-news. You can sign up for our Land Trust listserv, which is a way to pose questions directly to your land trust peers across the state and receive responses from them. It's been a really helpful tool, I think, since we launched that probably 4 or 5 years ago in partnership with Clear. The last thing I'll say is Love Your CT Land Trust, which is our brand that we love seeing on Instagram, with everybody sharing that as well. When you post your photos, just do your hashtag Love Your CT Land Trust. And it really has been a nice way for Connecticut's Land Trust to brand themselves and brand itself as a community. In fact, the Mass Land Trust Coalition asked if they could steal it somehow. And I said, well, you can, but you can't say Love Your Mass Land Trust. You have to come up with something on your own. So each month we have a Love Your CT Land Trust e-newsletter where we feature stories just like all of these from all of you. We just love to share your good news around the state and show off all the good work that you're doing. So that's CLCC. I think I've done my, you didn't give me the sign, Connie, but I'm going to stop now because I want you to be able to keep going along. And I'm going to stop this.
Okay, so if you will unshare, then I will reshare. I think that's it. Nope, we're doing this, I think. Oh boy, where was I? When you have too many windows open, when you're screen sharing. Okay, and you can see actually the website. I'm so glad that we had a chance to look at the website, but my static slide on CLCC not only points up our, tremendously helpful staff at CLCC, but also features the hashtag Love Your CT Land Trust, which I hope you will use. There's a link to the website, and absolutely, I echo Amy, sign up for the e-news, so informative, as well as the listserv where you can share with your peers. Just a minute more on some other resources, because once you get out of the state, if you could blow it up one level more, you get the Land Trust Alliance, which is our national organization, providing technical services and advocacy at a federal level for land trusts. The top is a screenshot of their website. The Land Trust Alliance maintains the Learning Center, which is sometimes hard to navigate, but a really rich resource for information for land trusts. And I do encourage you to check it out. I put the screen share for the Land Trust Accreditation Commission. 1 in 4 land trusts in the U.S. are now accredited, which is amazing to me. Many in Connecticut, and the accreditation program we'll probably talk about a little bit more because it is a program that is very closely aligned with the Land Trust standards and practices. More to come. And then up in the right-hand corner, I've placed some resources that are primarily resources for nonprofits, not just land trusts. And now we wanted to just stop for a moment and take any questions that you might have. Whoops, sorry, I don't know how to get back to my toolbar here. I want to look in the chat. If you have any questions about anything that we've gone over so far, you could put that in the chat. We'll see if I or Amy can answer those for you. We're just going to wait a moment before moving on. And I do want to, again, kind of, I don't want to belabor how much fun the CLCC conference is when we can do it in person, but we are going to try and emulate a little bit of the networking that we would typically build into any program if we were doing it in person tonight. And so in a couple minutes, we are going to give you a chance to break out and see each other. Okay, so I'm just going to move on to what does it mean to serve on a land trust board, because that's really what this program is all about. What are you meant to do if you are on a land trust board? What are your obligations? And here I've put up, the very important idea that when you serve on a nonprofit board, you really do have a legal duty. You have, they sound like layman's terms. They are layman's terms, but they mean something legally. You have a fiduciary duty of care a duty of loyalty and a duty of obedience. And we'll go over those in more depth in the governance session, which is next week. But just, the short version of that is that as a board member, you really must keep informed, go to the meetings, know what's going on in the organization that you represent, and avoid conflicts of interest. Like, really make sure that the work that you're doing for the organization is in the best interest of the organization, not something that, is driven by your personal desire or something that, seems to be more of the mission of another organization. As a board member, it always comes back to your duty and obligation to oversee the operations of the land trust. And really that means you are responsible in the end for its programs and its financial management. As a board member, you are the ones that are responsible for ensuring that the land trust has the funding that it needs in order to carry out its work. So that's a really important concept and one that we'll talk about in both the governance and the financial management sessions later to come this month. And then I just wanted to, a really interesting distinction for me, and something that I think is helpful to recognize, because so many of us serve on all volunteer boards or work for land trusts that have very few staff. David Allen, who is also a consultant to land trusts, wrote a blog recently, and he was kind of pointing out that, when board members are doing things like stewardship, when they're doing monitoring, or if they're attacking that barberry, on the trail, or, even, going out and recording bird data, that they are doing the job of a staff person. So, just because a land trust doesn't have employees doesn't mean it doesn't have staff. The staff is you as board members. And so, while every land trust must make sure that it has the personnel to do what it needs, that personnel might be employees, it might be volunteers, it might be consultants. But it's really important to think about the distinction between the things that you're doing for the land trust that are, really personnel, and the things that you're doing in your function as a board member and when you're working in your governance capacity. Both of them really valuable. Couldn't do it without both of those things. But we are going to really focus more on, what you need to know in order to be a good governing board member. And so this is kind of the most casual of the sessions that we're going to have. Starting next week, they're going to get really dense. And we are going to dive into the land trust standards and practices, which is a body of guidance that is published by the Land Trust Alliance. It is something that was collected with input from the land trust community over time. There were several different iterations of the standards and practices as the movement developed and grew, but it's kept its main framework, which is that there are 12 standards that are further broken out into, more specific ideas that are called practices, and then even elements. It's kind of in a bulleted form so that, the ideas are sort of snapshot and easily digested. It's pretty overwhelming, I'm not going to lie. There was a time when I had it memorized, but I don't anymore. And I do remember that I had to read it like 15 times before I felt like I really knew what they were talking about. And yet, it's finite. This is kind of the Bible of what land trusts do. And I think that it's organized very well. And, as I put on the slide, I think one of the most important functions of this is that it allowed us to communicate about the same things to each other, using the same language, so that we really could develop, a body of practice, that when we said stewardship, we knew what we were doing and we were more consistent in what we were doing and could help each other. So, that's the standards and practices. And I'm just looking at Hank's question, is each land trust supposed to agree to follow the standards yearly or just once? And I think that the Land Trust Alliance expects you to just say it once, although I remember when the most recent version of the standards and practices came out in 2017 is when it was published. There were a number of revisions, and they did have land trusts kind of reaffirm, their promise to uphold the standards and practices. So that answers your question. Just quickly, in the standards of practices, the first 7 practices really relate to all nonprofits, things that any nonprofit organization is going to do. Remember I said you're responsible for the programs and the finances. So standards 1 through 7 are going to be the standards that talk about governing a nonprofit organization and managing the financial shop. And then standards 8 to 12 are things that are particular to land trusts. So standards 8, 9, and 10 deal with land protection or acquisitions, if you will, and then standards 11 and 12 deal with stewardship of conservation easements and then of fee properties. You'll also hear me talk about the buckets and the term the buckets, because although there are 12 standards, countless practices and elements, you can really boil it down to 4 main areas of land trust work. That is how we've organized the sessions that we'll be doing for the next 4 Mondays. And so if you think about the standards and practices in the terms of the buckets, then we're really looking at 4 separate, main areas of governance, finance, acquisitions or land protection, and stewardship. And I think that this is my last slide before we break out a little bit. And this is just, to illustrate that that the buckets, organized in those areas of governance, finance, land protection, and stewardship, really work very well within a land trust to think about your committee roles and responsibilities, and organizing an annual work plan or a strategic plan. And so it's quite common, that you'll have an acquisitions committee, a stewardship committee, that there is a finance committee, or a set of people within each board that is responsible for those different bucket areas. And likewise, many strategic plans, articulate goals that really follow along the bucket structure as well. So I think it's really helpful. That's just another illustration of, why I think the land trust standards and practices really moved us forward by giving us this common language.
Welcome, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Rebecca Dahl. I am CLCC's program manager. It's really nice to see all of your faces, or at least, know that you're here with us tonight for our second session of our new Land Trust Board Member Bootcamp. So, of course, tonight we'll be talking about board governance, and we'll get into that in just a moment. Just to orient us a little bit and to introduce the program, again, this is part of our Conserving Land by Staying Connected series, which we started last year in the wake of the pandemic to continue to stay connected and offer virtual workshops and discussion groups and roundtables. So we're glad to keep it going, and we're glad to see you here tonight. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it on over to Connie to get us started tonight.
Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. I hope that you're really enjoying our warming weather. Such a beautiful day. So I think that Rebecca covered most of the housekeeping, and I'm going to end up sharing my screen for the presentation, but my hope is that during the Q&A parts, and of which we've built in several different points, to stop sharing my screen so that we can look at each other. But before we start, another thing that we miss when we can't get all together like this is networking time. And so I hope that you will take just a moment to rename yourself to include your affiliation. So I'm pausing. I'm going slow right now because I'm doing this for myself, but I've just renamed myself Connie Manes, CLCC. And if you would do that for yourself as well, then that helps all of us know where you're tuning in from. And I can't remember if Rebecca said it, but I do want to let you know that we are recording these sessions with the intention of making them publicly available on CLCC's website. I hope that you are at this point all seeing my screen. And if I can just find my advanced slides, great. So this is session 2 of our board boot camp, and we are talking primarily here about the land trust standards and practices. So we will be using standards and practices as kind of a reference and guide for this series. And I've asked Rebecca if she can find it in follow-up to send you all the PDF file so that you all have a copy of the booklet that contains these in their text. The standards and practices, as I mentioned last week, provide an operating framework for land trusts, and most importantly, a common language for us to talk about our work, which is pretty broad in scope. The standards and practices were last updated in 2017, and they consist of 12 standards, the first 7 of which apply to all nonprofit organizations and concern nonprofit governance and financial management. The latter 5 standards, standards 8 to 12, are particular to land conservation and cover land protection and stewardship. The standards and practices further break down into 4 topical areas that are sometimes called the buckets. That's the vernacular that we refer to in the Land Trust Alliance as the buckets. These buckets are governance, which is the subject of tonight's talk, financial management, and again, these 2 last subjects are applicable to all nonprofits. And those correspond to the first half of the standards. The third bucket is land protection, also known as acquisitions, land acquisitions, sometimes land transactions. And the fourth is land stewardship. And those last 2 buckets comprise the second half of the standards and practices. So tonight's session will cover the material that is in standards 1, 2, 3, 4, and 7. In Connecticut, land trust board service often entails more than just sitting in a boardroom. Land trust consultant David Allen recently blogged about the distinction between volunteer work relating to the governance of an organization and volunteer work which carries out the activities of the organization. I'm paraphrasing his blog, but he underscores the legal charge for nonprofit boards to provide oversight and governance, including developing an organizational mission, using plans, budgets, and policies to manage activities consistent with that mission, raising the funds necessary to implement those plans and budgets, overseeing the use of the funds and resources in a transparent and responsible manner, and ensuring the board's long-term sustainability in perpetuity, all things which we will talk about tonight. But for typical Connecticut Land Trust board members do a lot more than this. In particular, smaller organizations with few or no staff. Board members negotiate land deals, blaze trails, lead interpretive hikes, and on and on. But these activities are not the main job of a board. They are personnel activities, which could be performed by any unpaid volunteer, or for that matter, by paid contractors or staff. Put another way, the distinction between volunteer or unpaid work and staff paid work is less important than the difference between board work, governance and management, and staff work, which is everything else. And put another way, when board members spend all day Saturday doing trail work, they are not acting in a board capacity. When the trail is done, their board work remains, as much as we all love to do it. And most of us got involved because we enjoy the personnel part, doing stewardship work, educational and community activities, hiking, but the governance work is essential to keeping the organization going in perpetuity. Tonight, we're going into that boardroom. Our next 2 sessions on land protection and stewardship after this week will provide insight into the work required to do deals and manage properties for those of you who will be doing that work or who want to know more about how others are doing that in your organization. Tonight's material, however, is important for every board member to know and appreciate. So board members have a real legal and fiduciary duty to provide oversight of operations and finance. Those duties are expressed in terms that may seem like layman's terms, but are actually terms of art used in legal claims. Before you get too nervous about that, please be assured that nonprofit board members are offered some legal protections so long as they carry out their duties in good faith. In addition, Most organizations offer further protections against liability through indemnity clauses in their bylaws, as well as by purchasing directors and officers insurance to protect directors from having out-of-pocket expenses incurred in defense of claims. These fiduciary duties include the duty of care, which uses a prudent person standard to hold board members responsible for knowing what's going on in their organizations and for exercising actual governance through discussion and decision-making, for being engaged and involved, in other words. Stay informed, go to meetings. Note that in order to exercise the duty of care, board members can have the expectation that they will be provided with the information they need to do this. The duty of loyalty means that the director must take actions and make decisions in the best interests of the organization and no other entity. This duty requires us to demote other interests that we might have personally or in connection with other organizations. For example, if a director would really love their neighbor's vacant property to be conserved, but it doesn't have particular conservation value, it's not proper to try and convince the land trust to conserve it. I know you all know that, but that's the easiest example. We'll talk more about conflicts of interest later in the hour. The duty of obedience keeps us aligned with the organization's stated mission and vision, and doesn't let us go too far afield in taking unrelated actions, even if they have a public benefit. For example, an organization with a mission to protect farmland would probably not sponsor a recreational dog park. If an organization finds themselves in this position where they're starting to drift, often enough, it might be appropriate to look at the strategic plan, because it's not as if the organization can't change its vision. It's that while its vision is what it is, it should align, its actions should align with that vision. So, to the standards and practices. Standard 1 has 4 components, and I'll touch on each briefly. The first is ethics, and part of being a tax-exempt organization is the promise to affect a public good. So taking donations in lieu of tax dollars really requires us to uphold high standards of ethics in our business practice. Easy enough. Community engagement requires thoughtfulness with respect to the public that we serve. Who are our stakeholders? A broad group, maybe near and far, so people within our communities, people who may visit our communities, human or no. Some organizations consider animals to be their stakeholders, consider resources to be their stakeholders, existing or future generations. We must keep those in mind and work to build relationships for the most authentic service. The third part is mission, vision, and strategic direction, and one's strategic plan. Many land trusts have a written strategic plan, which is produced as the outcome of working sessions, long retreats to look at stakeholder needs, organizational strengths and weaknesses, opportunities in the community. Some organizations don't write their strategic plan down, but still do this kind of exercise and thinking. Strategic plans tend to cover about 5 years, although there are some that are shorter or longer. They really don't have to be groundbreaking, like there's some acronym like the big, hairy, I don't know, crazy idea, something like that I couldn't come up with today. And they can be that. But if they're not that, no worries. They're most helpful really if they're straightforward and attainable. And for land trusts, I usually find that the categories that are addressed in strategic plans are land protection, stewardship, programs such as hikes in education, outreach, communications, social media, PR, fundraising, and organizational capacity. And then from the strategic plan flows the annual work plan. So the annual work plan outlines the activities to be undertaken in the coming year. And this is most helpful if it aligns with the fiscal year to the extent that it's not the calendar year. So in other words, if an organization uses a July to June, then the annual work plan would cover that time period, because the annual work plan should coordinate well with your budget and your fundraising plan. So the annual work plan, because it flows from the strategic plan, is going to cover business activities such as annual filings and updates to policies and your audit or your financial review, but it's also going to cover your planned programs, land protection matters, land management activities, anything that you have planned for the coming year. It can be coordinated topically with committees if that's helpful to the way that your organization works. For example, at the Kent Land Trust, where I work, our work plan is divided up by committees, and the committee chairs each year compile the goals for review and later adoption by the board. The work plan should also, as I said, coordinate with the budget and the fundraising plan. And I compare this to a three-legged stool because without each of them, they alone can't stand. So each item in your annual work plan, if it has a cost associated, that cost should be reflected in the budget. And the budgeted income should, of course, be calibrated and planned so that it can cover the needed costs. So perhaps this is easier to see in the reverse. Without the necessary funding attached, objectives in your annual work plan, such as creating a new trail, are unlikely to be fulfilled. Standard 2, and then I think we're going to take a little break. So I hope that, if questions are coming up, I hope that you'll share those in chat or consider asking them audibly. Standard 2 deals with compliance and laws. This includes incorporation in the state of Connecticut. Nonprofits here are called non-stock organizations, and there is a filing made annually with the Secretary of the State. It also includes obtaining tax-exempt status from the federal government, which is done by application to the IRS. This status as a public charity allows us to accept donations for which donors may claim a charitable deduction, and it also exempts us from paying taxes. The IRS issues a letter often needed to demonstrate this status when you're making purchases. So you may receive a copy of this in connection with your land trust work so that we won't be charged tax. And again, there is an annual filing which is made on IRS Form 990, which we'll talk about more in the financial management session. Nonprofit organizations must adopt bylaws which direct how the organization operates, including whether or not an organization has members, how directors are elected and their responsibilities, how meetings are conducted, most of the time explicitly covering whether conference and video calls are allowed. So that was really important to all of us last year and continuing, of course. Standing and ad hoc committees may also be explicated in the bylaws, officers and their responsibilities, and the indemnification of directors, which we talked about in connection with fiduciary duties. Finally, Standard 2 of the Standards and Practices covers provisions of federal law of tax-exempt organizations around certain prohibited activities. So the most important of which is that tax-exempt organizations must not confer a private benefit, including a private benefit to board members, which is called private enormment, or an impermissible private benefit where the activities of the organization disproportionately benefit one individual as opposed to the general public. Tax-exempt organizations must not engage in political campaigns. They are meant to have a broad public benefit, not a partisan benefit. And there are special organizations, as you know, like PACs, that can do that kind of work. Finally, there are limitations on lobbying by nonprofit organizations. For the most part, any work that you do in responding to CLCC's calls to action, for example, is not going to put you anywhere near the threshold. This is really talking about major expenditures of your organization towards lobbying. You would need to really be spending a major proportion of both your time and your money in your organization on advocacy. So please do respond to those calls for action. Thanks. All right, moving on to Standard 3. This is where we get into the real meat of board service. This standard outlines the board's responsibility for program oversight, ensuring financial health, and ensuring that the organization is currently and in the future will be stable by investing in itself. The standard is not organized in exactly the way that I've laid it out in the slide, but we can include, sorry, my notes, but we can include as a board's major way of overseeing programs, the board's oversight of any executive staff, which would in turn be responsible for overseeing any other staff. So I just want to, if I just confused you, I confused myself too. So let me let me explain what I was talking about there. Over here on the left-hand side, the idea that the board might oversee programs for consistency with mission and vision and public benefit. Within the standard itself, there is a bullet point on evaluating the executive director. And so my point being that if an organization has executive staff, that is its primary way of overseeing programs, because the executive staff would then oversee the rest of the staff in the organization and the implementation of the programs. Okay. Included, moving into the middle, including within oversight of financial health and sustainability are the board's responsibility to adopt the annual budget, fundraise to meet operating needs, review periodic reports relevant to financial management, including understanding what assets are available for operating expenses as opposed to restricted for other purposes. The board should receive reports that are appropriate to the scale of the organization and with a frequency that is appropriate to the organization. And that might mean every single board meeting, or depending on the scale of your organization, quarterly or even biannually might be fine. It is the board's responsibility to review the annual audit or financial statements and to review and authorize the filing of the IRS Form 990 tax return. The board should make and follow policies as to the investment of and management of funds. And finally, it should adopt and implement policies and procedures to limit risks of misappropriation or misuse of organizational funds. And here I'm talking about those internal checks and balances, or internal controls, such as having one person authorize the payment of expenses and a second person be the check writer and check sender. Much more on that, by the way, in the financial management session. And it is the board's job to make sure that it's able to do its work. So moving on to the right-hand side of the slide, which means ensuring that it has a sufficient number of members who have sufficient skills and attributes. And this means paying attention to needs for recruitment and communicating to prospective and current board members the expectations for service in a job description or a board responsibilities document. The board should arrange for some orientation and training to help newly elected directors do their jobs. So, maybe this is it for you, or maybe your board does something else special to orient you to that exact organization. I hope they do. And there should be some method of periodically evaluating the service of individual board members, as well as the functioning of the board as a whole. And this will help plan for transitions as some directors retire or change offices and committees. Speaking of which, the board can and usually does apportion responsibilities among officers who are usually elected by the board and include the president or the chair, responsible for coordinating the board and the organization, the treasurer who's responsible for financial matters, the secretary who's responsible for minutes and record keeping. The board also may delegate some functions to standing or ad hoc committees such as a finance committee, governance, land protection, stewardship, communications, fundraising, or other committees. And organizations have many different versions of what their committees are. So there's no there's no one set list of what your committee should be. It's really how your organization apportions and delegates its work. It's a good idea to have descriptions of these committees, whether within your bylaws or as a separate board document. And one final note, many of our land trusts have an executive committee. These are sometimes used in between meetings to facilitate the needs of the board. They're usually made up of the officers. But I want to just send home the idea that the executive committee should not be making decisions for the board. It is up to the board to have a democratic decision-making process. So usually, if an executive committee is needed in between board meetings to make a decision, this is going to be a rare occurrence. Maybe the decision is so emergent that that one can't arrange for a conference call or a special meeting. If the executive committee makes a decision in this case, what they should do is immediately report that decision to the board, and then the board should ratify it at the next regular meeting. we really want to strive for full board participation in all decision making. And it's time to pause for more questions. So I will stop sharing.
Connie, I did get a question in the chat here, and it's a two-parter. Do land trusts typically do thorough annual planning and action plans? And can you provide modified advice for smaller land trusts?
So let's see, to the first one, I would encourage doing annual planning. And it doesn't have to be complicated. In fact, when I started doing consulting for the Land Trust Alliance, there was this idea of your strategic plan and then the annual work plan, which came from it. There were tons of examples for strategic plans and like none for annual work plans. And I was like, well, why is this? Either no one does it, or, what does this annual plan look like? And I made one up because it didn't seem that hard. I took the strategic plan, I took its goals, and I just made up, well, how are we going to pursue this year? I categorized it by committees, which, maybe would work for your organization or maybe not, but it's a really important way of just kind of framing out the year and figuring out, well, what is it that I'm going to do? And that whole piece about the three-legged stool, if you're just going to go about your work with no plan, then how do you know what your budget should be? And how do you know how much money you should raise? It's, it does not have to be, this crazy 20-page document. It could be 2 pages. It could be 1 page, maybe. But if an organization can just get to the point at the end of its fiscal year where it can reflect back and look forward and say, what is it that we hope to do this year? And even write it down in bullets and incomplete sentences, I think it'll be really helpful for you. So in terms of modifying for a smaller organization, I would say just do this less formally than you think that maybe it would be in a perfect world. Doesn't have to be shared publicly, just internally within your organization. Give it a shot and see how it goes.
Connie, we've got a few more. Oh, excellent. I think that answered the question totally. So we've got a few more questions coming into the chat. One is there a typical amount of meetings with non-board members along with board members?
So there's a couple of different things that I can think of. I'm not entirely sure about your question. If it's referring to inviting the public to your meetings, I have seen organizations do both. I've seen organizations that do invite the public to their meeting and go into executive session if needed. That is a model that works. Or there are organizations that don't invite the public to their meeting, not required for a nonprofit organization. If what you're talking about is the practice, and this is a great practice to use of having non-board members be members of committees. I haven't seen it specifically where a board meeting might have those non-board members from committees. I can see where that might be useful. I definitely do encourage you in your committees to try out prospective board members by inviting them to serve on a committee, and also broaden your personnel workforce by inviting members of the community who might not have the time or the interest in sitting on a board and being in that boardroom from that slide that I showed, but do have the desire to serve your organization. As for a typical number of meetings, this is really off the top of my head, but I would say that most organizations in Connecticut meet either every month or 6 times a year.
Looks like that answered the question completely, Connie. And I know that just to add to that, I worked for a seasonal land trust, or not a seasonal land trust, a year-round land trust in a very seasonal town. And we did meet 6 times a year, despite the fact that it was a little more congregated sometimes than other months. We have a couple more. One was just about if we are going to share the slides, and I wanted to confirm that with you, Connie.
That's fine.
All right. Yeah. So I'll add the slides to our follow-up email. That's an easy one. And Yeah, that looks like everything. Lee just chimed in about annual meetings here. That's when elected board members, that election takes place, and any member that's there can attend. And then Hank from North Branford Land Trust has mentioned that all of their meetings are open. And only, yeah, go ahead, Connie.
That's great. You know what? I really encourage you to dialogue and share your own experiences with your colleagues here. That's a great way to test out what I'm saying, because I could be wrong. And then just to kind of get back to the comment about an annual meeting, I just want to distinguish your board of directors meetings with your membership meetings. Many of us here in Connecticut have a structure where we have members of the organization, not just people who contribute that we call members, but actual legal members according to our articles of incorporation. And usually those meetings are open to, of course, they're open to people who are not on the board, because they're open to all your members. But it's a common practice to invite members of the public to those meetings as well. So that might be a little different, just to distinguish that. All right.
We have time for just one more question, Connie.
Sure.
The question is, do members of the organization have a right to attend board meetings?
I would go to your articles of incorporation and your bylaws on that. I think that in some cases they might, but in other cases they don't have any right to. But I think all of that would be governed by your articles and by your bylaws. All right, I'm going to share us up again. And then move to the next slide. Great, which is where we start on Standard 4. Standard 4 is really important, and it's about the board's responsibility to guard against conflicts of interest that might influence the board's decision-making. Nonprofit organizations should have a conflict of interest policy specifying that conflicts of interest will be avoided or managed so that undue influence will not corrupt decisions that should be based solely on the best interests of the organization. Conflict of interest management is of utmost importance, but it's also not fully understood because it's easy to feel defended about them when in fact they're not unusual at all and do not by themselves signify any bad intentions. Managing conflicts well goes a long way towards showing organizational integrity. More important even than a conflict of interest policy, it's the board's awareness of the need to manage conflicts, and it's all about issue spotting. Here are a couple of ways conflicts with board members may arise within your organizations. Your organization wishes to hire a board member or the board member's family or the board member's place of business to perform services to the organization. The organization is considering a conservation easement donation from a board member, or a property adjacent to a board member's home, or the organization is undertaking stewardship activities on properties when a major donor stands to benefit. If you are able to identify that there is a conflict, you can usually manage it to make clear there is no undue influence, no private enormment, or impermissible benefit. Because usually when a board member is providing services, it's far below fair market value, if not free. And even so, the conflict must be identified and steps taken to ensure that whatever decision is made is in the best interests of the organization. And be aware that there may be people outside of the board who are in a position to exercise influence, such as major donors, prominent local or political leaders, and others with information or a relationship to the organization, unlike that of the general public. Be on the lookout for times when personal interests may come into play and take steps to remove that interest from deliberations. Lastly, always document the actions taken to mitigate a conflict, whether this be by noting recusals within board minutes or a separate memo detailing benchmarking and arm's length negotiations. Now we're going to take a little look at conflict of interest policies and some of the significant parts of a policy. Conflict of interest policies usually define who are covered, which we call insiders, And this may be board or family of board, staff, those with special information, significant donors. The policy mandates disclosure and physical recusal from the discussion. Okay, so not enough just to not participate. The conflicted party must leave the room physically. And that's because even though, even when we're not talking, our actions may confer some disapproval or, may otherwise make an attempt to influence. So you could be tapping your foot or staring aggressively, must physically recuse. Conflict policies suggest the means of managing a conflict and the steps towards mitigating them. Requires documentation. Usually there's a clause that prohibits board members from getting loans from the organization, and also boards from being paid for their service on the board. So no prohibition against, provided the conflict is managed correctly, no prohibition from paying a board member to perform professional services, but no payment for your service on the board alone. Sorry if any of you were misled as to that, but I think we pretty much know that part. Finally, many conflict of interest policies have annual forms to be filled out. These are not required, but they're a great way to remind the whole board of its duties with regard to conflicts, as well as to prompt thinking about anything new that might present a conflict. So, it's one time a year when you have a chance to reflect and say, gee, did I join any boards? Did I buy a property? Anything that might conceivably result in a conflict could go on that form. But the bottom line is that whether or not you fill out a form, you're still responsible to disclose and manage conflicts whenever they arise in the course of business. And I have a pause again. There are often questions about conflicts of interest, so we'll take a few.
I know there was one holdover question from the last round of questions, which is it valuable to allow access to minutes for members? Sort of board meeting minutes.
I would not do that, but I'm an attorney. And so, to me, I would want to, as much as possible, prohibit disclosure of minutes to, the public domain in case they need to be protected, for in case they get involved, they're involved in a future litigation. So personally, I would say no. I think it's fine to maybe summarize the minutes and to use components of what's discussed in the meeting as your communications. But the other thing I think is that, I don't know, maybe your minutes are more entertaining than mine, but usually it's, it's a pretty dry blow by blow of what's discussed at the meeting and votes. So I really, I don't see the potential for them so much to be used as a communications tool. So I don't know. That's my answer. If you disagree or there are compelling reasons, put it in the chat. Let your colleagues know why or why not.
So next question in the chat is, when you say disclose COI or conflict of interest, disclose to whom?
To disclose to the board. So basically, make it known to the entire board that there is a conflict of interest. And so what you would say is, for example, I have a conflict of interest and I am going to recuse from discussion and voting on this matter because I live across the street from the property that you are discussing right now. And obviously I might have a personal interest that, that could potentially conflict with my decision making in the best interest of the organization.
And Connie, if I can ask a follow-up to that, is it typically disclosed in board meeting minutes when someone has to recuse themselves from voting or has a conflict of interest?
Yes, you don't need to fully summarize the conflict necessarily. might not be a bad idea to do that. You know, I can't see that there's an argument necessarily for saying, you know, for not saying why there's a conflict, but really, you know, the simplest way that you would do this is you would just have a line in your minutes that said, you know, at this point or before discussion of this next item started, so and so physically recused him or herself from the meeting due to a conflict of interest. And then you would indicate when that person came back in. And depending on the conflict, you know, and this is, you know, it gets very case by case, but remember that you may not have finished managing the conflict just by doing that, because like if it's depending on what kind of conflict it is, you might not want to release those minutes to the conflicted person until after the decision has been made, because then they're going to see what the discussion was about. And so, you know, really, it's going to depend each and every time. But the simplest thing, the simplest decision, you know, you still want to document in the minutes that the person left the room and was not physically present.
Kind of as a nice follow-up to that is Joe's question: if a board member has a potential conflict on a decision being voted upon by the board, should the member remove themselves from the conversation entirely until the discussion and vote has been finalized?
So I would say yes. And the exception to that is that occasionally the board member is invited at the very outset of the discussion to provide factual information that might be helpful to the board in making its decision.
Excellent. I think that is all of the questions. Jennifer from East Granby has put in the chat some of her experience as well. And yeah, keep on coming.
Okay. I'm gonna reshare and move on to standard 5, which is about fundraising. And so the standards and practices cover fundraising from the standpoint of what legal and regulatory compliance may be needed, not really an organization's specific methods for success in fundraising. So not you know, what it is they should do in order to raise money and any kind of evaluation of what fundraising is better than other fundraising, but strictly some of the laws and regulation around it. And these include state laws, which require licensure or registration for organizations that are soliciting charitable donations. In Connecticut, we must register with the Department of Consumer Protection. If an organization is soliciting in more than one state, it should check the laws that are particular to each state that it's soliciting in. They also include rules around compensation of fundraising consultants. Most of the time, the consultants will be well aware of these, but you know, really what it is that consultants aren't allowed to charge a commission that is based on the amount that they raise from you, is I think the way that I understand it. But ask about that if you have any questions if you're engaging a fundraising consultant. I'm going to skip ahead on this slide for a moment. The standards include taking care to honor donor requests for anonymity, oh my God, to be anonymous, and being respectful of donor privacy and their information. And also that care should be taken to be accurate in your solicitations, including solicitations that are made for a specific purpose, such as to build a trail or to preserve a certain property, and to be accurate in acknowledging those gifts with tax thank you letters, especially those that are made for a specific purpose, which are otherwise known as donor restricted funds. And here I want to mention that CLCC will be offering a special program after this series ends on financial management to go a little deeper, and that will include the subject of donor restricted gifts. So please give a look out for that. Finally, included in Standard 5 is the idea that land trusts might receive property donations not for resource protection, but as non-cash assets to support operations. And if this is the case, be sure to be upfront with the donor about the purpose and the intended use of the donation and document it all in writing. Doesn't happen a lot, but it certainly does happen occasionally. All right, almost done. Standard 7 is about personnel capacity and the need to make sure the organization has what it needs, whether through use of staff, contractors, or volunteers. So if and when using staff, the standard covers having job descriptions and regular performance reviews, which are done by the board for the executive director and by the executive director for others, if your organization has that kind of a staffing model. It covers arranging for appropriate training and paying a fair salary, and implementing personnel policies that are appropriate to the size and scale of the organization and as required by law. If an organization is using contractors, they should take care to put that agreement in writing, the form of which might vary according to the contract. So for example, a $15,000 contract might call for an RFP and a bidding process, whereas a $1,000 job may not and might involve a simple letter agreement. But in any event, the writing should lay out the schedule, the scope, and the compensation, and the land trust should have a means of ensuring that the contractor is qualified and has the requisite insurance. And then lastly, if an organization is using volunteers, I just want to see my slide, I didn't make notes about this, but then it should take care to ensure that it has a method of training and orienting those volunteers, supervising them while they're doing their work, and then most importantly for donor retention, a way of thanking and communicating the relevance of that volunteer's work to the organization and the community. All right, this is my final slide. Just laying out some suggested components for a board manual. And not all organizations have gotten to the stage where they have a board manual yet, but I hope that if yours has not, that you will kind of take up the charge now that you know what's commonly in it. Usually policies including the code of ethics or a whistleblower policy, board responsibilities, and the job description, which we talked about when we were discussing standard 3, bylaws, conflict of interest policy, a record keeping policy, which we'll talk about in next week's session, financial management and internal controls procedures, investment management, and then, particular to land trusts, if land trusts hold easements, they might have an easement enforcement policy and an easement amendment policy. In addition to board policies, it's common for board manuals to contain the contact information for other board members, a map of the organization's, protected properties, maybe some history of the organization, the strategic plan and the annual work plan, the budget, recent financials, including perhaps the 990 or the most recent audit, and activities calendar. So a list of important dates for the board to keep in mind as the year progresses. And then finally, if there are any volunteer stewardship procedures and monitoring forms, things that would be helpful if the organization is using volunteers to monitor its properties. So if I can find my cursor. That leads us to the last slide, and I am going to stop sharing and once again see if there are any questions before we close.
So we've had a couple come in the chat now, and one of the questions is, do fundraising consultants need to be registered with the state as well?
I don't know the answer to that. Is anyone on the call a fundraising consultant? When I've looked for them before, they've always come recommended word of mouth. And so I never really looked on the state's website to see if there was a section on that. It's a good question. I'm going to check.
I'll start that one. Yeah, that is a good one. Angela in the chat has said, contact your local municipal attorney. So I'm guessing to clarify that question. And then there's another question here, and I may be being a little dense because I'm not sure what this acronym is, but it's, does the board review the AE, or does the board have input into the review and the president serves as the point person to make the actual review?
Okay, well, I'm not sure what the AE is either. I mean, so perhaps, um, perhaps Beth, you might put that in chat. In terms of how boards review the executive director, this is I guess, less rigid, and there are many different ways to do it. I would say that it would be helpful to have anyone who works with the executive director be part in some way of providing feedback. It would probably be fine in many cases for the board president to kind of to organize and captain that process of evaluation, and then to provide a report back to the board that is the review, but also, could be, even richer if additional people who work with the executive director are involved in the actual review. And then in terms of the actual performance evaluation, there's a lot out there online to read about this, but I would say that, there's a certain, vibe in a room if, 6 or 7 people are sitting across a table from the person being reviewed and delivering the review, that might be less comfortable than having fewer people, and that it really depends, on your relationship with your executive director. I encourage you to trust yourselves, and most importantly, to not let indecision about the process hold you back from actually doing it. Because that's what I've seen more than anything else, is that, because no one's arrived at the perfect process yet, they don't do it at all. And that, I think, is a real missed opportunity.
Right. We have a question in the chat from Rick. That's if a nonprofit receives government grants, don't sunshine laws require at least some of the board meetings be open?
I've never heard that before. So Rick, if you can point me towards that requirement, I'd really appreciate knowing about it. I've not had that be part of any government grant contracts, but there may be government grants that your organization has received that are different from the ones that I've seen before. So I'd be interested in hearing more. Again, I appreciate you coming tonight, and I hope to see you back next week when we will take up the subject of land transactions. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone. And I just put a link in the chat to our calendar of events. So if you haven't signed up already, please, for next week, please head over there to sign up, or for any of the other sessions. But thanks so much, everyone.